Hi, my name is David Sugar, and I'm here to talk about The Science of Systems, a new book I wrote. And this is part of a 12-part video series where I'm going to go over each chapter in the book in more detail. So today, I want to talk about chapter 1, which is all about an intro to systems. What does it mean to think about systems when it comes to systems science? So, one of the first questions one could ask is, what is a system? An easy approach to this is to think about a system as drawing it with nodes, these are the elements, and then arrows, which are the relations. And a key part is that this can really represent anything. This could be atoms, chemicals, cells, or even companies in a supply chain. And the relations can represent any kind of relations that may be between these different elements. So a system is a highly generalized way to think about a set of elements and a set of relations between those elements, whatever they may be. Some examples of systems are logic. In logic, the propositions are the elements, and relations include operators like and or, as well as implies, and other axioms or rules that are followed by the propositions. Geometry introduces geometric elements such as points and lines and circles, and the relations include ratios and other kind of ways to relate different geometric objects. Now, systems can also model real patterns of nature, including atoms, cells, humans, and planets like the solar system. So a system is a really generalized thing about elements and relations, whatever they may be: logic, geometry, atoms, cells, humans, society, all of that. So a systems view implies something that's much different than another view of science, which I'm here calling a part-space view. In a part-space view, it's all about linear systems, where the whole is a simple linear addition of all the parts. But when the parts are interconnected, it's possible for the model of the whole to be different than joining the model of the parts. In this case, this is called a nonlinear system. And a lot of the systems thinking concepts are really surrounding the notion of nonlinear systems. When different elements are connected to one another, then the whole can have different emergent effects that are different than just studying one part in isolation. And this can often lead to chaos, like chaos theory, and complex systems that are hard to predict. So a systems view is in large part moving from a part-space view, where it's looking at the world as separate, different elements that easily add, and seeing the world in terms of networks, in terms of connectivities, where there's different emergent levels of patterns. One classic example is the three-body problem. Two gravitational bodies can be easily predicted. However, when there's three gravitational bodies, most orbits lead to chaos. There's no analytical mathematical formula to say these are where all the three bodies are going to be in a future time when giving initial conditions. So a way to have to calculate this chaotic system is you plug it into a computer, which is subjected to resolution and other limits, and you let the computer run and you can see the result. But there's no easy formula that can officially predict ahead of time. So by lacking efficient predictability, this is a complex system and it has chaos. And so chaos arises just in three bodies. So imagine all the particles in the universe. So chaos and the need to take a systems view occurs in almost every pattern that we see. It's not the exception. It's almost simple systems are really the exception. They're very rare to find. Almost every other pattern in nature is complex. So complex system science and complexity theory has a lot of different names, which is being referenced to recently. This is all kind of a new paradigm of science, which is thinking in terms of networks, thinking in terms of complexity, thinking in terms of emergence. I just want to highlight some topics of complex systems. One is, are systems closed? Are they open? And how can a system maintain equilibrium, such as a complex biological system, which can reach homeostasis, a balance of the chemical reactions that create life? Pattern formation, symmetry is another type of thing that's observed as different parts come together, and they create different macro level patterns. We talked about nonlinearity, and one of the effects of chaos, and that is also the butterfly effect, where small initial changes of conditions can create huge ripple effects over time. So this is creating a situation where it's very, very hard to predict the future state. Also, collective behavior, we see this in flockings of fish and birds and simulated computer flockings, where the whole can have emergent properties. It's constructed from the rules of the part, but the whole as itself is not easily explained by joining each part in isolation. Networks theory, and a big part about networks is that scientific and mathematical models can not only be applied to atoms or chemicals, but be applied to social systems, political systems, and that can be used to try to design more robust, more sustainable networks. System change is also an essential part of a systems thinking view. Most of the systems in our world, water, energy, food, are complex systems with many moving parts. Understanding interconnections and identifying key levers of change is a really important way to make sustainable and systemic solutions. So systems thinking is also essential to be an active change agent in our modern and interconnected world. So these are just some examples of why the systems-based view is really important and kind of pervades a lot of these different disciplines. So just zooming out a little bit, or getting back down to basics, what is a more formal definition of a system? Well, a system can be defined as a set of elements and a set of relations. This is often abbreviated in my book as S equals E, R. Another way that a system can be written is to identify the governing relations. And this is often what is done in terms of a system of equations. They may say that the system of equations includes x equals 0. And maybe there could be other things like y equals 5 and z equals x plus y. It can be any set of equations. And these two definitions are equal to one another. One is just highlighting key rules that are followed by the relation. And the colon here represents such that. So it's a system such that a governing relation like x equals 0 is followed. The more precise definition, S equals elements and relations, it includes every relation. So for example, in the system of equations as x equals 0, there would also be other things like the identity relation that x equals x. But that doesn't really tell you very much about what's going on in the system. So x equals 0 is the rule that wants to be highlighted. And then these other kind of identities and other more basic rules are just taken as assumption. But for the more formal definition, it includes every element and every relation between those. So these are just different ways that one could go about expressing a system and the different types of systems. So there's a lot of different systems with different types of elements, different types of relations, and this by means is no exhaustive list, but just highlights a few. We talked before about logic. There can also be formal languages where the elements are different letters and the relational rules are the grammar of how the letters relate to one another in words and sentences. There could be computers, and then there can also be real systems like atoms, molecules, DNA, cells, neural networks, ecosystems, society as a whole. And these are often nesting systems in a way. For example, an atom is an element of a molecule, but then the molecule is an element of DNA. But then DNA is an element or part of the cell. And so it kind of goes on like this. So these would be called different emergent models in nature, and we'll get more into precise definitions of that soon. But the interesting part to note now is that a system, the elements can take on whatever may be relevant for that model, right? Is it the atomic scale, molecular scale? And the relations are what are the relational rules that apply? Is it an electromagnetic field or is it intercellular communication? So just want to highlight these different approaches. So now I want to take a step back, and we have some initial definitions of a system, some initial examples of systems. There are some core concepts in system science and how science thinks about systems that are repeated in lots about disciplines. So I wanted to review some of these concepts, and each chapter in the future will go more into depth in these concepts, but this will give an initial review of what's going to be covered. So one is the idea of an emergent model. And this is when limiting a lower level model or lower level system maps to a higher level model. So a classic example is temperature. The lower level model is understanding the position and momentum of each particle. So the momentum is the velocity and its mass, so how much energy it contains. Now, a limit you can take of all these molecules is to coarse grain or take an average. And this limit limits some detail about it. So you're limiting the detail of all the individual particles just to get the total amount of particles, or the total energy, or the average energy. And so when you do this limit, what you get is temperature. So temperature is not a property of one molecule. It's a property of the limit of many molecules. So this is an example of an emergent model. And another way to think about it is that the lower level models have a larger domain, a larger realm or larger set of possible scenarios that it can explain, while the higher level model has a smaller set of possible scenarios it can explain. So the lower level model of particles and their kinetic energy can explain particles even at one level, or a couple particles, or a few particles. But temperature only works when you have large amounts of particles. Temperature breaks down when you start reaching a few particles. So the domain is smaller. So even though emergent models are often thought about as bigger, right? So it's like atoms, or then there's chemicals and cells. There's actually a smaller domain associated with each of those. So practically, we looked at all those different emergent models of atoms, molecules, chemicals. Those are all different emergent models in nature. So taking a limit, most of these limits are coarse grain or averaging, but there can be other limits that can be taken, like lower energies or not moving as fast as close to the speed of light. Now there's an essential philosophical point about emergent models, which is one that the lower level model is constructing, essentially building the higher level model. So this goes against the idea that the higher level model is something fundamentally new. It's not that there's something fundamentally new about temperature. It's just that that's another description which is constructed from the lower level model. But the higher level model, right, temperature, can be something completely different than what would be seen at the lower level. So, for example, the lowest level in current physics is quantum field theory, right? So that's what the lowest level in science is, quantum field theory. Everything else is an emergent thing. So solidity, phases of matter, and every other property we see would basically be another emergent model. Importantly, each level is constructed from the lower level, but even though it may be wholly different than what is experienced or the model contains at the lower level. Additionally, the higher level may not be efficiently predictable by the lower level model, which is often the case in nonlinear and chaotic systems. So, what this means, for example, is biology will never violate the rules of chemistry, but biology may not be efficiently predictable by chemistry. Additionally, the rules of chemistry will always be compatible with the rules of physics, but the rules of physics may not efficiently predict chemistry. So there's this kind of interesting thing where it's constructed by on one end, but it's also can be different than and can often be impossible to efficiently predict by the lower level. So we'll get more into emergence, but there's some really interesting things here about the connections between disciplines. And an essential part here is a key assumption in science is the unity of science, that science attempts to describe rules that apply to all of nature. So following the unity of science, rules about all of science, like physics, should always be compatible with rules of some of nature, like biology. So all the different emergent models should always be hypothetically compatible. But because they're not always efficiently predictable, there's often not a mathematical way to go from physics to biology. But the whole premise of science is that there is one reality, so these should be unified, that there should be a unity of science. So a big goal of science is to try to understand the connections between emergent models. And that's why systems thinking is looking at all these different models and the emergent models and also the connections in between them. So another really classic example of a property of a system is boundaries. A closed boundary can be thought about as a boundary where there's nothing that enters and there's nothing that leaves. So conserved quantities should remain the same. So the change of conserved quantities, like energy is posed to be conserved, the change of that would be zero in a closed system. Now, thermodynamics also has the term isolated system, which is a system closed to matter and energy. So an isolated system, these conserved quantities would never change. Now, in contrast to a closed system, there can be an open system, and this allows a flux over a boundary. So change in conserved quantities in the universe can be allowed. The change can be, not equal to zero. It can change in or it can change out. And so there's a lot of different properties between closed versus open systems, and this plays a key role in thermodynamics and even studying ecosystems and engineering. So wanted to highlight that. Another really interesting part about a system is symmetries. And symmetry is often thought about, they're looking at mathematical formulas, but it can also be thought about as a property of a system. That a symmetry of a system is understanding which transformations bring a given part of a system back to itself. So if you have an equilateral triangle and you rotate it by 120 degrees, it will look identical as a start. So that's a symmetrical mapping. So symmetry is all about a map that brings an object back to itself. Some examples are bilateral symmetry. So this includes invertebrates like butterflies and also a lot of vertebrates. In a bilateral symmetry, flipping the left and right side will make the image interchangeable. Now, symmetry can also be extended to volumes. So a cube can be rotated in 3 dimensions along many ways and be identical as a start. And there's lots of symmetrical mappings of a cube because all the faces are the same. Now, a symmetry can not only be translational like tilings or rotational like some of these shapes, but also be across scale, where a same pattern is repeated at the small scale and the large scale. And that's what's called a fractal. So fractal is a symmetry across scale. And this example here is a 3-dimensional snowflake where each protruding edge contains the pattern before, continuously getting smaller and smaller and repeating over scale. Another property of a system commonly used in physics is the notion of entropy. Something with low entropy means that just a few microstates or one microstate will lead to a given macro state configuration. So the picture on the left shows all the gray boxes in the center and all the blank boxes on the outside. Assuming each box is identical, there's only one configuration for this to occur. However, when you're going to the right, it's getting more disordered where there's about 50-50, where about half of the boxes are gray and half of them are blank. There's a lot of different microstates, which will give that same average macro state. And entropy is also an example of an emergent model because it's taking the limit of coarse graining. So while each state is equally likely, there's only a few of those that lead to the ordered, a macro state of ordered, while many of them lead to a macro state of a disordered. And so one example of this is flipping a coin. There's many opportunities to flip about 50 tails and 50 heads and 100 flips, but there's only one way to flip 100 heads or one way to flip 100 tails. So while each state is likely, because there's so many more outcomes near 50-50, that's where you would expect to get. So the second law of thermodynamics is that isolated systems tend to increase in entropy over time. They don't tend to decrease. So interestingly, though, an open system can use energy in controlled ways to decrease entropy locally if the environment increases enough so the second law applies. So this can be seen in life. Essentially, life is making order seemingly to contradict entropy, but they're able to do this through the use of energy, and actually the total entropy still is increasing. But so entropy plays a key role in understanding physics as well as life. So information systems and information theory is really a revolutionary way that was posed largely by Shannon in 1948 in this paper, which laid out this model here, which is the Shannon-Weaver communication model. And this was really the first attempt to quantify information in terms of mathematical terms. And this model is all about there's an information source and there's a destination. And this could be thought of, for example, as a radio tower. So there may be a radio tower that sends out information, and the destination could be your car's radio. Now, when a lot of the information is transferred, this is called that the mutual information is high. So the information of the information source, all those bits of data are going to the destination. That means the mutual information is high. A lot of this signal was received. But if there's more noise in the system, or more noise is disrupting the signal, the mutual information may decrease, and there'll be less in the destination. So bits were an essential way to think about what is information. How is it physically marked? How can it be transmitted? The exposure to noise. Additionally, information pairs really well with the notion of computation. Computers are basically about sending information from one place to another, as well as processing it. And bits is often think about as a way to store data, data transfer speeds and all that kind of thing. Additionally, control systems are a very interesting thing where sensors receive information from the environment and use that to control outputs. Like a thermostat senses the heat to control the heater. So cybernetics was another field related to systems theory where information is core, and cybernetics is about control and communication in the animal and the machine. So it's all about how control systems can be used, how information systems are used, and also computation. And this can be integrated through biology as well as engineering. So taking a step back, what information theory really did was there was a really grounded physical theory at the time, starting with Newton, and then there was quantum mechanics and relativity, and there was a really detailed physical understanding of the world. But it lacked this notion of information or computation. Information theory now provide a mathematical way to say, hey, these physical markers can also represent logic, can also represent information, can also represent messages. This can be transferred, this can be processed. So essentially, instead of seeing the world just as an assortment of atoms, now these atoms can process logic, they can sense, they can control, they can be a cybernetic system. And this really provides a more clear connection to computation. And now we're in the informational age, so this is really, we see it everywhere with computers and the internet. But now this information theory really provided a way to integrate science all the way from the physical, nature of physics to communication, control, and computation. So another key part about systems is complexity. And there's not a really strict definition of complexity, but in complex systems, predictions can be impossible. And we talked about this with chaos and nonlinearity. So it's often impossible to reduce an answer to a yes or no result. This can be seen in lots of systems like weather, ecosystems, economics, the stock market, politics, society, where predictions are really hard to make, right? It's almost impossible to have perfect weather predictions for 10 days out. They often change. So the key part here is that complexity is associated with the difficulty to predict. A system that's simple is easy to predict, like 2 bodies under gravity, while a complex system is hard to predict, like 3 or more bodies under gravity. And almost all the systems of our world, right, like weather, economy, ecosystem, they're all complex. So simple systems are really the exception. Like what we're mostly facing are complex systems. So sustainability is another key part about systems thinking. A sustainable reservoir can be one that's where the replenishment rate is equal to the extraction rate. So for example, if the amount of trees are being cut down equals the amount of trees that grow that year, that would be a sustainable way to maintain that reservoir. Now, if more trees are growing than what being cut down, it's a regenerative. It's regenerating the reservoir. If less trees are growing than what's being cut down, it's extractive. It's slowly extracting the reservoir. And society as a whole, basically, we're extracting many of the reservoirs of our Earth, from ecological reservoirs to also physical minerals and other resources. And what this is happening, this is creating a situation where the reservoir will likely not last many generations if the current pace is considered. I think estimates say that humans take about 1.75 Earths right now. So we're using, 1.7 times more than what's being replenished. And these are probably conservative estimates. So it's also zooming out a little bit. Life itself has evolved to be sustainable, where if life depleted the reservoirs of resources or energy that it depended on, then it would cease to exist. It would die. So life has evolved to have reciprocal relationships between like animals and plants, like the carbon dioxide and oxygen cycle, for example, to keep things in balance. Because if life depleted the very reservoir which allowed it to survive, it would cease to live. So life has really evolved from this systems perspective, where the fitness is not just about the organization or the organism. It is about the organism in the environment. The fitness is how fit an organism is in the environment. A key part about that is not depleting the reservoirs and the resources, but maintaining those over time. So sustainability is a key challenge for humanity, and systems thinking can provide some key ways of creating solutions. So transformation, this notion of systems change, of systems can change over time, is really important. So transformation is trying to understand, how do systems change and what are the most useful and easy ways to change systems? So a big part is understanding the interconnections within and between systems, and also finding leverage points, and also working with different stakeholders to get a shared understanding of what's going on, identify the relevant factors, and then really work on fixing the root causes instead of symptoms, and figuring out leverages where you can change one thing that helps create a more systematic change. Now, from a part space view, it's often about one linear connection between one piece and another piece, that doing X will lead directly to Y. But from a systems view and a nonlinear view, there can often be lots of more interconnections between that, and that those parts is not the whole picture, that you have to study the whole system, and there could be butterfly effects, emergence and collective behavior that should be thought about when making change. So a systems thinking perspective can really help one become an effective change agent. So these were some of the system fundamentals that we're going to go over more in various chapters, but want to give you a quick snapshot. Now, let's try to wrap up this as a whole. How can one kind of organize all these different systems and get a unified perspective? Well, one delineation is between foundational to applied systems. In this case, foundational and theoretic systems are abstract systems, while methodological and applied systems are more concrete systems of nature. So a foundational system would be like a formal system of logic, which are base rules and how they are applied. Theoretical systems are now saying what can come out of these rules, right? So from the initial axioms, what are other provable models? Now, methodological systems are saying, let's actually test, let's actually do stuff in nature and use that to inform a model. So, for example, Euclid laid out some very initial axioms of geometry. Now, there's lots of theoretical proofs that one could make from that foundational system of geometry. But let's say there was an unknown ratio that can't be solved, but it could be drawn in such a way and measured. So methodological would be to actually measure that to inform the model. So it's not a formal proof, but it's a methodological proof. And science is essentially all about these methodological proofs. They're all about testing models and seeing which model applies. Finally, applied systems is really a real world use of a model. So for example, in case of geometry, construction. Geometry is used all the time for construction. So it's highly applied, it's in the world, and it's all about thinking about what works, not necessarily what would be logically valid. So here are some examples of these different systems. So starting with the most abstract, a general system, just a general set of elements and a general set of relations. Now that can be specified in a lot of different ways for different foundational systems like logic, math, graphs. Different theoretical systems further specify, what logic are we talking about? Is it propositional logic? There's also first order logic, other kinds of logic. What math are we talking about? Algebra. There's a lot of different theoretical proofs that can be extrapolated after the foundations. Now, different methodological systems of science like physics and biology, it really references what models do we think apply to nature. So it's using tests to say, what is the best explanation of how nature works? And finally, more applied systems like engineering, sociology, healthcare, sustainability are really about the full integrations of using these models in a human-centric way of our real interface with concrete systems in nature. So, and finally, that connects to real systems, which is essentially a hypothetical notion of what nature is. Now, we don't know exactly, we can never really prove exactly what nature is, but more applied and methodological systems work to help define that and use to think about which models should we use, which math and logic models actually work for helping describe the world, which are useful. So we were talking a little bit about the difference between these formal models versus real models, and I just want to highlight some of these differences. One is that, a formal model, that could be like math or logic or all these kind of abstract systems we're talking about. They can provide a model of reality or real systems, but we never really know what real systems is. So even if a model is 99.999% correct or even 100% correct, there's no test that can say this is actually how nature works, right? There's no test for that. So what this means is that the map should not be confused for the reality itself, right? A map is not reality. It's a model of it, but you can argue that one model is more useful than another model, but there's no test to confirm that a model is what nature really is. Now, there's another really interesting thing, which is that all models are also part of nature. And this is why in this diagram, real systems are enclosed formal systems. So for example, if there's a landscape, but then a map of the landscape, well, the map is always in the landscape, right? The map is never outside of nature, because assuming the idea that nature is all that there is, or real systems are all that they are, there's nothing outside. There will be no truly objective perspective that every modeler is part of the reality they are modeling. And, one could say, well, my model can be about everything not in reality. I can write a book of saying everything not in reality. And that is totally fine, right? So not all models are about real systems. There could be about math. They can be about anything. Only a subset of formal systems are about real systems. But the key point here is that it's impossible, for example, for a book about everything not in reality to not be in reality. It can't be bigger than the universe, for example. This book can't move faster than the speed of light. Basically, the markers, the informational markers of a formal system can never violate physical laws. So you can have data about something that's not in reality, but that data itself could never be bigger than the universe, can never have more energy than the universe. It can't disobey the laws of the universe. So in a way, all formal systems are limited by physical laws. And so that's an interesting connection here that we can talk more about. So wanted to draw out some more differences and distinctions between formal models versus a scientific model, or trying to understand which formal models are applied to nature or not. So a formal model is really true, valid, just based on the form. So if it's such that A equals B and B equals C, then it's always true that A equals C. So from logic, it has no meaning what A, B, or B, C, if those are real or not real. It has nothing to do with it. All that matters is the form. And if the form is correct, then according to formal logic, these are correct. So this would always be a valid logical argument. Now, a scientific approach is really saying which of these logical approaches actually makes sense of nature. So if one was to say, a human is immortal, well, first of all, the background theories of biology say that no organism lives forever. Humans don't live forever. So that shouldn't be true. So basically, science is about really assessing what's informal, what's inside a formal system. And logic and math, geometry, those are about just a formal model of this is true based on the form, but it doesn't actually say what it is or if that's true in nature. A science uses methodology, applied systems to try to understand which logical systems actually apply to the world we see. Though it can never actually be proven that's what nature is, we can find ones that are more useful over time. So wanted to highlight system science as a whole. It really straddles between formal systems like abstract models, concepts, representations, and real systems, these tools and practices to create change. And systems science, well, it's really the intersection between those two. Which models are useful for understanding the world? And also, how can we create effective change in the world? And some key principles in system science, these system fundamentals that we went over, like equilibrium, entropy, complexity, these really cross disciplines. So these really helps understand a unity of science, that there's not all these separate disciplines. The whole notion of science is that there's one nature, that nature is a unified whole, and that everything should be consistent. So system science is really nature trying to understand nature, right? If humans are part of nature and we have science, science is part of nature and it's trying to understand and model nature itself. It's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So system science is really this intersection of how can we as part of nature understand nature itself. So thank you for this first part of the video. This was about systems. We're going to get into all these topics into more detail. So hopefully you'll stay and learn more. And again, if you want to go to the website, it's davidsugar.com/book. And there's a free PDF of the book I want to offer to everyone. Additionally, if you want paperback to see it in person, it's really great with all the images. You can go to amazon.com. And also there's a link in my website. Thank you.